For 6 years, my brother told everyone the same thing, that Dad left me nothing, not a dollar, not a property, not even a letter. Every family gathering ended with the same humiliating reminder. Rachel wasn't in Dad's plans. For 6 years, I believed him. Until one rainy afternoon when a lawyer placed a yellow envelope on the table. An envelope nobody knew existed. And inside was a truth that destroyed everything my brother had built. My father died on a cold November morning. The kind of morning where the sky stays gray no matter what time it is. I remember standing beside his hospital bed, holding his hand while the steady beeping of the machines filled the room. For weeks, doctors had warned us that the end was near. Still, hearing those words and living through them were two completely different things. Dad had always been the strongest person I knew, the man who could fix anything, the man who never complained, the man who somehow made every problem seem smaller just by walking into the room. Seeing him weak felt wrong, unnatural, as if the world itself had stopped making sense. I stood beside him until the very end. So did my brother Daniel, at least physically. Emotionally, he seemed somewhere else entirely. Throughout Dad's final week, Daniel spent more time talking to accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors than he did talking to Dad. At the time, I tried not to judge him. People handle grief differently. That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, something felt off. Very off. The funeral was held 5 days later. Hundreds of people attended. Dad had owned a successful construction company for nearly 30 years. He had helped build schools, churches, apartment complexes, and community centers throughout the county. People respected him, trusted him. Many loved him. As I stood near the front of the church greeting visitors, I heard story after story, stories I'd never heard before. A man talked about how Dad paid his rent when he lost his job. A widow explained how Dad repaired her roof for free after a storm. A former employee described how Dad helped him through a difficult divorce. The stories kept coming, and every story revealed another side of my father, a side he never bragged about, never advertised, never discussed. That's who he was. He believed kindness wasn't something you announced. It was simply something you did. After the service, everyone gathered at my aunt's house. The atmosphere felt heavy, sad, exhausted. People shared memories and comforted one another. For a few hours, it felt like a family united by loss. Then reality returned, and reality arrived wearing a suit. Around 6 o'clock, Dad's attorney arrived, Mr. Harrison, a quiet man in his 60s who had worked with Dad for decades. The moment he walked through the door, conversations changed. People straightened up. Questions appeared. Curiosity replaced grief. I noticed it immediately, especially in Daniel. My brother crossed the room before anyone else could reach the attorney. The two men spoke privately near the kitchen. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I noticed something. Daniel looked nervous, very nervous. Not sad, not emotional, nervous, like someone waiting for exam results. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Then Mr. Harrison left. No announcements, no discussions, nothing. Just a brief visit. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Later, I would realize that moment mattered far more than I understood. 3 weeks passed. Life became a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and unfinished grief. Losing a parent changes everything. Even simple tasks feel different. You reach for the phone to call them, then remember, you hear a joke they'd enjoy, then remember, you pass their favorite restaurant, then remember, the reminders never stop. Not at first. One afternoon, Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Can you come by the house?" Dad's house, the family home, the place where we'd grown up, the place filled with memories. I assumed there was paperwork to review. Maybe insurance documents, maybe property records, something practical, something normal. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived, several relatives were already there. My aunt, 2 cousins, Daniel's wife, a few close family friends. Everyone seemed strangely uncomfortable, as if they already knew something I didn't. The moment I entered the living room, conversations stopped. And that's when my stomach tightened. Because nothing good ever follows that kind of silence. Daniel stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. We met with Mr. Harrison. I nodded. Okay. Another pause. Then he delivered the sentence that would shape the next 6 years of my life. Dad left everything to me. The room became silent. Completely silent. I blinked, certain I'd misunderstood. What? Daniel sighed dramatically, like this conversation was somehow difficult for him. The will. He looked down briefly, then back up. Dad left everything to me. At first, I wasn't angry. I was confused. Very confused, because it didn't make sense. Not because I expected equal money, not because I cared about inheritance, but because it didn't sound like Dad, not even a little. My father believed in fairness, always had. The idea that he would completely exclude one child felt impossible, yet everyone around me seemed ready to accept it. My aunt finally spoke. Apparently, he updated the will years ago. Years ago? That surprised me even more, because nobody had ever mentioned it. Not once. Not during holidays, not during family discussions, not during Dad's illness. Nothing. I looked toward Daniel. Did Dad explain why? Daniel immediately shook his head. No. The answer came too quickly, too smoothly, almost rehearsed. Then he added, "It's what he wanted." Something about those words bothered me, deeply, because they didn't answer the question. Not really. Yet everyone else seemed satisfied, or at least willing to pretend they were. The discussion moved on, people changed subjects, conversations resumed, but inside my head, one question kept repeating. Why? Why would Dad do that? Over the following weeks, Daniel repeated the story constantly, to relatives, to friends, to neighbors, to anyone who asked. Eventually, a new version emerged, a more damaging version. According to Daniel, Dad had become disappointed in me. He claimed we'd grown apart. He suggested Dad didn't trust my decisions. He implied I hadn't been there when Dad needed me. None of it was true. Not even close. But once a story gets repeated enough times, people start believing it. And that's exactly what happened. Family gatherings became painful. Every conversation seemed to include subtle reminders. Comments about the inheritance, comments about Dad's wishes, comments about respecting his decision. Some relatives looked at me with sympathy. Others looked at me with pity. A few looked at me with suspicion, as if I'd somehow failed a test nobody told me existed. The worst part wasn't losing money. The worst part was losing Dad's reputation in my mind. Because if Daniel was telling the truth, then my father had spent years secretly distancing himself from me. The thought haunted me, day and night, for months, then years. Eventually, I stopped asking questions, stopped arguing, stopped defending myself. What was the point? Nobody seemed interested in hearing another version of the story. The narrative had already been written. Daniel inherited everything. Rachel inherited nothing. Case closed. Or so everyone believed, including me. 6 years passed. 6 long years. I built a life, focused on work, moved into a small townhouse, made peace with things I didn't fully understand, or at least tried to. The pain never disappeared completely, but it became manageable, like an old scar, something you stop noticing until someone points it out. And then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Because a phone call arrived from a man I hadn't spoken to in years, a man named Mr. Harrison, Dad's attorney, the same attorney who handled the will, the same attorney who disappeared after the funeral, the same attorney who carried secrets nobody knew existed. His voice sounded older than I remembered, more tired, more serious. And after a brief greeting, he said something that instantly made my heart race. "Rachel, there's something your father wanted you to have." I froze. "What do you mean?" A long silence followed. Then he spoke the words that would unravel 6 years of lies. "I found an envelope." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Rain tapped softly against my kitchen window as I gripped the phone. I found an envelope. My pulse quickened immediately. An envelope? After 6 years? Mr. Harrison exhaled slowly. I should have contacted you sooner. The sentence made my stomach tighten. What kind of envelope? Another pause. Then, one your father specifically addressed to you. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. The room suddenly felt smaller. Dad specifically addressed to me. For 6 years, I'd been told he left me nothing. Not money, not property, not even a final message. And now his attorney was telling me there had been an envelope with my name on it the entire time. I drove to Mr. Harrison's office the next morning. The same office I'd visited only once before, right after Dad's funeral. The same office where Daniel had walked out looking relieved. Rain still covered the streets. The sky looked heavy and low. Everything about the morning felt unsettled. Mr. Harrison met me personally in the lobby. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, more serious. Without much conversation, he led me into his office and closed the door behind us. Then he placed a worn yellow envelope on the desk between us. My name was written across the front in my father's handwriting. Rachel. Just seeing it nearly broke me. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before looking up. Why didn't you give this to me 6 years ago? The question came out sharper than I intended. Mr. Harrison didn't flinch. Instead, he removed a folder from his briefcase. Because your father instructed me not to release it immediately. I frowned. What does that mean? He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. It was signed by my father. Official. Notarized. Detailed. I read the key line twice before it fully registered. This letter is to be delivered to my daughter Rachel, only if circumstances arise that suggest my final wishes have been misrepresented or concealed. My chest tightened. Misrepresented or concealed. Dad had anticipated this. Somehow, he had anticipated this. I looked up slowly. He thought someone might lie? Mr. Harrison hesitated, then answered carefully. Your father became concerned during the final year of his illness. He believed certain conversations about the estate were happening without his knowledge. Certain conversations. He didn't say Daniel's name. He didn't need to. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. The paper felt old, fragile, important. For 6 years, this had existed somewhere in a forgotten file, while I spent those same 6 years believing my father had chosen to erase me. I opened it carefully. Inside were 3 things. A handwritten letter from Dad, a copy of an earlier will, a bank statement showing a trust account in my name. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. A trust account? I looked at the bank statement again. The account had been opened 8 years earlier, with my father's signature, and a balance large enough to change my life completely. My vision blurred. This can't be real. Mr. Harrison leaned forward. It's real, Rachel. Then why did Daniel say Dad left me nothing? The attorney removed his glasses. His expression hardened slightly. Because Daniel never saw these documents. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Your father separated part of the estate intentionally. The public will handle the family properties and business interests. The private trust and this letter were kept confidential under his instructions. I stared at him. So Dad didn't leave me out. No, he absolutely did not. The room went silent. Because that single sentence rewrote 6 years of my life. I unfolded Dad's letter. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but unmistakably his. Rachel, if you're reading this, then things did not happen the way I hoped they would. A tear slipped down my cheek immediately. You were never left with nothing. I separated part of my estate because I feared pressure, manipulation, and arguments after my death. My hands tightened around the paper. I hoped your brother would handle things honestly. If he did, this letter would never need to be opened. I stopped reading. For a moment, I simply stared at the page. I hoped your brother would handle things honestly. Dad had trusted Daniel, and deep down, he had also worried about him. The conflict in that sentence broke my heart. I kept reading. If you are seeing this now, then the truth matters more than keeping the peace. The truth matters more than keeping the peace. I whispered the words aloud. They felt like permission. Permission to stop doubting myself. Permission to stop apologizing for questions nobody wanted me to ask. Permission to stop carrying shame that never belonged to me. Before I could continue, Mr. Harrison said something unexpected. Daniel contacted me last week. I looked up sharply. About what? He wanted copies of additional estate records. He specifically asked whether there were any sealed documents or side agreements. My stomach tightened. Did you tell him? I told him I was reviewing archived materials. He paused, then added, he sounded worried. For 6 years, Daniel had acted untouchable, confident, certain, comfortable. Now he was suddenly asking questions, suddenly checking records, suddenly worried about hidden documents, which meant he already suspected something. The lie was cracking, and he knew it. I turned to the second document, the earlier will. This version was dated 2 years before Dad died. It divided the estate equally between Daniel and me. Equal shares, equal treatment. Exactly what I had always believed Dad intended. Then I noticed a handwritten note in the margin. Revised distribution pending trust completion. Rachel's portion moved to private trust. Dad's initials appeared beside it. Mr. Harrison explained quietly. Your father wanted to protect your inheritance from potential disputes tied to the business. I frowned. The construction company? He nodded. Your father was concerned Daniel might use business pressure to consolidate control over the estate. He believed a separate trust would reduce conflict. I almost laughed at the irony. Dad created the trust to prevent conflict. Instead, it created 6 years of misunderstanding, humiliation, and lies. I looked down at the trust statement again. The amount was substantial, life-changing substantial. But strangely, the money wasn't what affected me most. It was the proof. The undeniable proof that my father had not abandoned me. For 6 years, I had carried a wound built on a false story. And now the foundation of that story was collapsing. Slowly, violently, completely. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I looked at Mr. Harrison. What happens now? He met my eyes steadily. That depends on what you want to do with the truth. Outside, rain slid down the office windows in long gray streaks. Inside, 6 years of silence had finally begun to break. And for the first time since Dad died, I realized something terrifying. Daniel hadn't just inherited the family business, he had inherited control of the story. Now that control was slipping away, and when he realized I knew the truth, he would do whatever he could to protect himself. The envelope had exposed everything, but it had also started a war I wasn't prepared for. For 6 years, Daniel controlled the narrative. For 6 years, he told relatives, friends, and business partners the same story. Dad left Rachel nothing. Dad made his decision. Dad had his reasons. And because nobody had evidence to challenge him, the story became accepted as truth. People repeated it. People believed it. Eventually, even I believed parts of it. Now, for the first time, I had proof that everything was built on a lie. The question was no longer whether the truth existed. The question was what to do with it. That night, I barely slept. Dad's letter sat on my kitchen table. I must have read it 20 times. Every sentence felt important. Every word carried weight. Not because of money, not because of inheritance, because it restored something I'd lost years ago. My relationship with my father. For 6 years, I'd carried a quiet pain. The belief that Dad chose Daniel over me. The belief that somehow I had disappointed him, failed him, lost his respect. Now I knew none of that was true, and the relief was overwhelming. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. The timing immediately felt suspicious. We rarely spoke anymore, not unless family gatherings forced it. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello? His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Too cheerful. Hey, Rachel. I waited. Daniel never called just to chat. Never. Sure enough, after less than a minute of small talk, he got to the point. I heard you met with Mr. Harrison. My stomach tightened instantly. So he knew, or at least suspected something. I kept my voice calm. Yeah. A brief silence followed. Then, what did he want? The question sounded casual, but underneath it I heard tension, concern, fear. And that was new, very new. For 6 years, Daniel had acted completely confident. Now he sounded nervous. I decided to answer carefully. He found some old paperwork. Silence. Longer this time. Then, what kind of paperwork? There it was. The real question. The question he'd called to ask. Not how I was doing, not why I met the attorney. The paperwork. I looked out the window. Rain clouds still covered the sky. Why are you asking? Daniel laughed. A forced laugh. An uncomfortable laugh. No reason. Which immediately told me there was a reason. A very big reason. The conversation ended a few minutes later. But something had changed. For the first time in 6 years, Daniel wasn't controlling the situation, and he hated it. 3 days later, another surprise arrived. My cousin Lisa called. Lisa and I had always been close, not best friends, but close. Close enough to be honest. Usually. Rachel. Her voice sounded hesitant, nervous. I need to tell you something. My stomach tightened again. The past week seemed filled with uncomfortable conversations. What happened? She hesitated, then finally said, Daniel's been calling everyone. I sat upright immediately. What do you mean? Everyone, she sighed. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends. Why? Another pause. Then, because he's scared. The words hung in the air. Daniel. Scared. Those two things rarely appeared together. What exactly is he saying? Lisa sounded uncomfortable. He's telling people Mr. Harrison found fake documents. I froze. Fake documents? I couldn't believe it. He said what? He claims someone might be trying to challenge Dad's will. The room went silent around me, because now everything made sense. Daniel wasn't worried about the truth. He was preparing for it, building a defense, creating confusion, controlling the narrative before facts could emerge, the same thing he'd done 6 years earlier, only this time there was a problem. The truth existed on paper, signed paper, official paper, and that made it much harder to manipulate. A week later, the family gathered for my aunt's birthday. Normally, I would have skipped it, but this time felt different, important, necessary. The moment I entered the house, I felt tension. Conversations stopped briefly. Eyes followed me. People looked curious. Whispers moved through the room. Clearly, Daniel's phone calls had done their job. Rumors were spreading. Questions were spreading. And nobody knew exactly what was happening. Daniel stood near the dining room table. The moment he saw me, his smile disappeared. Not completely. Just enough. Just enough for me to notice. For several minutes, we avoided each other. Then eventually, he approached. Drink in hand. Expression controlled. Careful. Calculated. Rachel. Daniel. The air between us felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. He lowered his voice. I hear you've been asking questions. I almost laughed. Questions? For 6 years, I'd barely asked any. Now suddenly questions were a problem? I've been reading Dad's letter. The reaction was immediate. His face froze, only for a second. But it happened. And that second told me everything. Everything. What letter? The words came out too quickly, too sharply, too defensively. I simply looked at him. And for the first time, Daniel realized something. I knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to make him nervous. Enough to make him lose control. Enough to threaten the story he'd spent 6 years protecting. The conversation ended there. Not because Daniel wanted it to, because family members began approaching, interrupting, watching, listening, and suddenly Daniel didn't want an audience. Not yet. Later that evening, something unexpected happened. My aunt pulled me aside, quietly, away from everyone else. She looked nervous, guilty, ashamed. The expression immediately worried me. "What is it?" She stared at the floor, then finally spoke. "There's something I should have told you years ago." My heart started pounding. "What?" Her eyes filled with regret. "I heard your father arguing with Daniel." The room seemed to tilt. "What?" She nodded slowly. "It happened about 4 months before your dad died." I couldn't breathe. For 6 years, she'd kept this secret. 6 years. "What were they arguing about?" She swallowed hard, then answered. "The estate." I closed my eyes. Because somehow, I already knew. Deep down, I already knew. He wanted control. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He said splitting things would hurt the company. I listened carefully. Every word mattered. "Your father disagreed." My chest tightened. Of course he did. That sounded exactly like Dad. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that made the entire puzzle finally start fitting together. "He told Daniel something I'll never forget." I looked at her. "What?" She took a deep breath, then repeated Dad's exact words. "Being the oldest doesn't make you entitled." Silence. Complete silence. Because suddenly I could hear Dad saying it. Clearly. Perfectly. Exactly. My aunt wiped away a tear. "He was angry, Rachel." "Dad?" She nodded. "The angriest I'd ever seen him." That statement alone was shocking. My father rarely raised his voice, rarely lost his temper. Yet somehow Daniel had pushed him there. And now I understood why. Because this wasn't about money. It never was. It was about fairness, respect, truth. And Dad had seen something in Daniel that worried him. Something serious enough to create a secret trust, a hidden envelope, and a contingency plan. That night, as I drove home, one thought repeated over and over in my head. The truth wasn't just exposing Daniel. The truth was exposing years of manipulation, years of carefully crafted lies, years of people believing a version of events that never happened. And somewhere ahead, a moment was coming when all of it would finally be revealed. Publicly, completely, irreversibly. Because Mr. Harrison had already scheduled a family meeting, a meeting he insisted everyone attend. Daniel, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, everyone. And according to the attorney, Dad's complete letter would finally be read aloud. Every word, every instruction, every truth. The same truth Daniel had spent 6 years trying to keep buried. And when that meeting arrived, someone's reputation was going to collapse. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday, 3 o'clock. Mr. Harrison's office. Attendance requested. Not optional. Requested. That single word became the topic of conversation all week. Everyone wanted to know why. Everyone wanted answers. And judging by Daniel's behavior, he wanted the meeting canceled. 2 days before the meeting, my phone rang. Daniel. Again. The third time in less than 2 weeks. That alone told me how worried he was becoming. I answered. "Hello?" His voice sounded strained, almost desperate. "Rachel, maybe we should talk before Saturday." I leaned back in my chair. Interesting. For 6 years, he had no interest in talking. Now, suddenly, he wanted a conversation. "What about?" A pause. Then, "This whole thing." Very specific. And yet somehow completely vague. I waited. Eventually, he continued. "I think people are misunderstanding things." Misunderstanding. Not lying. Not hiding. Not manipulating. Misunderstanding. The choice of words wasn't accidental. I stared out my apartment window. Traffic moved slowly below. Rain clouds drifted across the afternoon sky. What exactly are they misunderstanding? Silence. Long silence. Then, You know, Dad loved both of us. The sentence almost made me laugh. Because if that was true, and I believed it was, then why spend 6 years telling everyone I'd been left behind? Why allow relatives to assume Dad rejected me? Why never correct them? Did you tell people Dad left me nothing? The question landed hard, immediately. Daniel didn't answer. Not right away. And that silence told me more than any explanation ever could. Finally, I told them what I understood. I closed my eyes. There it was. The first crack. The first shift. No longer certainty. No longer confidence. Now it was merely his understanding. And those are very different things. The call ended shortly afterward. But one thing became clear. Daniel wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing for damage control. And that meant he knew something bad was coming. Saturday arrived. Gray skies. Cold wind. The kind of weather that made everything feel heavier. I arrived 10 minutes early. The conference room was already half full. Family members sat quietly around a large wooden table. Nobody looked comfortable. Nobody looked relaxed. The atmosphere felt tense, expectant, like everyone sensed something important was about to happen. Daniel arrived last, which surprised me. Normally he liked being first, liked controlling the room, liked setting the tone. Today felt different. He entered quickly, avoided eye contact, took a seat near the far end of the table, and immediately started checking his phone, a nervous habit, one I'd never noticed before. At exactly 3 o'clock, Mr. Harrison entered carrying 3 large folders. The room instantly fell silent. No greetings, no small talk, no introductions. Everyone knew why they were there. The attorney sat down, adjusted his glasses, opened the first folder, then looked around the room. I appreciate everyone attending. Nobody responded. Everyone simply waited. Mr. Harrison folded his hands, then spoke carefully. Recent discoveries require clarification regarding certain statements made following Robert Bennett's passing. The room immediately stiffened. Clarification, a polite word. But everyone understood what it meant. Something wasn't right. Something had been hidden. Something was about to be exposed. Daniel shifted in his seat. The movement was subtle, but noticeable, very noticeable. The attorney continued. Before discussing financial matters, I need to read a document written by Robert Bennett. Dad's letter. The complete version. Not the portion I'd already read. The entire thing. Every page, every instruction, every concern. Mr. Harrison unfolded several sheets of paper, then began reading. My children. The room became completely silent. The sound of pages turning seemed loud, almost unnaturally loud. If this letter is being read publicly, then circumstances have developed differently than I hoped. Several relatives exchanged glances. Even Daniel stopped looking at his phone. I spent my life building a business, but I spent even more time trying to build a family. The words hit hard, because that was Dad. Always. Relationships mattered more than money. People mattered more than possessions. I trust my children, but trust is not the same thing as blindness. The room froze. Instantly, every person present understood the significance of that sentence, especially Daniel. Mr. Harrison continued. During my final years, I became concerned that future disagreements might create division. I watched Daniel carefully. His jaw tightened, just slightly, but enough. Because of those concerns, I created separate arrangements designed to protect fairness. The room grew quieter, if that was even possible. Fairness. That word again. Dad's favorite principle. The value he'd repeated throughout our childhood. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence nobody expected. Not even me. If anyone tells Rachel she received nothing from me, they are either mistaken or dishonest. A collective gasp moved through the room. Actual gasps. Several relatives looked toward me immediately, Others turned toward Daniel. The effect was immediate, devastating, because the statement left no room for interpretation. None. Daniel's face lost color. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but enough. Enough for everyone to notice. The attorney continued reading. Rachel's inheritance exists separately. The room exploded into whispers. Questions, confusion, shock. Everyone started talking at once. Mr. Harrison raised his hand. The room quieted. Eventually. Then he spoke. There is more. And there was. A lot more. The second folder contained financial records, trust documents, bank records, signed directives, years of paperwork, carefully preserved, carefully organized, carefully protected. One by one, the documents were presented. Dates, signatures, instructions, evidence, not opinions, evidence. The kind that cannot be argued away. Then the attorney revealed something none of us expected. Something even I didn't know. Dad hadn't merely created a trust. He had created detailed notes, private notes, notes documenting conversations, concerns, meetings, observations. One note was dated 7 months before his death. The attorney read it aloud. Daniel continues pushing for sole control. I fear he views inheritance as entitlement rather than responsibility. The room went completely silent. Another note followed. Rachel remains unaware of these discussions. I prefer it that way. She deserves peace. Tears filled my eyes. Because even in the middle of conflict, Dad was trying to protect me. Then came the most shocking note yet. The note that changed the entire meeting. The attorney hesitated before reading it, almost like he knew what would happen next. Then he looked up and spoke. Robert documented concerns regarding missing company funds. The room froze. Every single person. Daniel's head snapped upward, immediately. What? The word escaped before he could stop it. Mr. Harrison looked down at the page, then continued. Several transactions require further review. The room erupted. Questions everywhere. Confusion everywhere. Shock everywhere. Missing company funds? What did that mean? Mismanagement? Mistakes? Something worse? Nobody knew. Not yet. But one thing became very clear. This meeting was no longer about inheritance. It was about something much bigger, much more serious, because Dad had left behind evidence, and that evidence pointed toward a secret Daniel desperately wanted hidden. As relatives argued around the table, Mr. Harrison quietly opened the third folder, the largest folder, the final folder. And when I saw Daniel's face, I knew whatever was inside terrified him, because for the first time in my entire life, my brother looked genuinely afraid. And the truth hidden inside that folder was about to explain why. The conference room felt smaller than before. Nobody was talking now, nobody was whispering, nobody was checking their phones. Because the moment Mr. Harrison mentioned missing company funds, the entire atmosphere changed. This wasn't simply an inheritance discussion anymore. This was something else, something much bigger. And judging by Daniel's face, he already knew exactly where the conversation was headed. The attorney placed both hands on the third folder, the largest folder on the table, the one nobody had seen before. The one Dad had specifically instructed him to keep sealed, for years. Mr. Harrison looked around the room, then spoke carefully. Before I continue, I want everyone to understand something. The room remained silent. The documents inside this folder were prepared by Robert Bennett himself. He paused. They contain records he personally collected during the final year of his life. Every eye moved toward the folder, including mine. Then the attorney opened it. Inside were dozens of papers, bank statements, transfer records, meeting notes, business reports, emails, accounting summaries, years of information, meticulously organized, exactly the way Dad would have done it. Daniel swallowed hard. I noticed immediately. So did several relatives. The attorney removed the first document. 3 years before Robert's death, unusual transfers began appearing within the company accounts. The room stiffened. Unusual transfers, not illegal, not criminal, just unusual. But the implication was obvious. The attorney continued. At first, Robert believed they were bookkeeping errors. That sounded like Dad. Always giving people the benefit of the doubt. Always assuming mistakes before motives. But then came the next sentence. The transfers continued. Silence. Complete silence. Over 27 separate transactions. A cousin gasped. Someone shifted in their chair. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Mr. Harrison slid several copies across the table. Relatives leaned forward, studying dates, amounts, signatures, records, evidence, real evidence. Then he revealed the number, the total amount involved. The room froze. More than $48,000. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The number seemed impossible. Huge. Life-changing. Shocking. My aunt looked pale. One cousin whispered, "Oh my God." Another simply stared at the papers, unable to process what he was seeing. Then Mr. Harrison continued. The funds were moved gradually. He pointed toward a series of highlighted entries. Small enough not to attract attention. The room remained frozen. Then someone finally asked the obvious question. Where did the money go? The question hung in the air. Heavy. Dangerous. Unavoidable. Mr. Harrison looked directly at Daniel, for the first time all afternoon, and Daniel immediately looked away. The attorney opened another document, then quietly answered. According to Robert's investigation, the funds were connected to accounts controlled by Daniel Bennett. The room exploded. Voices everywhere, questions everywhere, shock everywhere. What? That can't be right. Daniel? What is this? The noise became overwhelming. Relatives spoke over each other. Nobody knew what to think. And in the middle of it all sat Daniel, silent, motionless, pale. For 6 years, he'd controlled every conversation, every explanation, every narrative. Now he couldn't find a single word. Finally, Daniel stood. This is ridiculous. His voice sounded strained, tight, desperate. You're making it sound worse than it is. The room became quiet again. Everyone wanted to hear his explanation. Everyone wanted answers. Daniel pointed toward the paperwork. Those weren't stolen funds. Nobody interrupted. They were loans. The explanation landed awkwardly, weakly, because the records immediately raised another question. If they were loans, where was the paperwork? Mr. Harrison calmly answered before anyone else could ask. There are no signed loan agreements. Daniel's face tightened. No repayment schedules. Worse, no board approvals. Even worse, no supporting documentation. The room became deadly silent, because suddenly Daniel's explanation wasn't holding together. Not at all. For years, he'd been the successful son, the responsible son, the son who inherited the company, the son everyone trusted. Now people were seeing something completely different. And then Mr. Harrison delivered the final blow. Robert confronted Daniel about these transfers 6 months before his death. The room froze again. Daniel's eyes widened. Instantly. Because he hadn't expected that. Mr. Harrison removed another sheet of paper. Dad's handwritten notes. Notes describing the meeting. Notes written only days afterward. The attorney began reading. Daniel insists he deserves more because he stayed with the business. The room remained silent. I reminded him that entitlement is not inheritance. Several relatives exchanged glances. He became angry. Nobody moved. Angrier than I have ever seen him. The words echoed through the room. Then came the sentence nobody expected. For the first time, I realized my son was counting my assets before I was gone. A collective gasp spread across the room. Even after all the revelations, that sentence hurt the most. Not because of money, because of disappointment. The disappointment of a father realizing something painful about his child. I felt tears forming again, not for Daniel, for Dad. Because no parent deserves that realization. No parent deserves to wonder whether they're loved or simply valued for what they own. The room remained silent. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel sat down, slowly, quietly, and for the first time all afternoon, he stopped arguing. Because the evidence wasn't just exposing financial decisions, it was exposing motives, character, choices, years of hidden behavior. Then Mr. Harrison opened the final section of the folder, and what he revealed next would change everything. Because Dad hadn't simply uncovered the missing money, he'd created a final safeguard. A safeguard designed specifically for this moment. A safeguard that would determine exactly who inherited the remaining assets. And when the family learned what Dad had done, the inheritance everyone thought belonged to Daniel would disappear overnight. The conference room had gone completely silent. Nobody was whispering anymore. Nobody was looking at their phones. Nobody was even pretending to stay calm. For the last 2 hours, every belief the family held had been challenged. The inheritance, the business, the story Daniel told for 6 years. Everything was falling apart. And now, according to Mr. Harrison, there was still one final document left, one final safeguard, one final decision Dad had prepared before he died. The attorney opened the last section of the folder, carefully, almost respectfully, as if he understood the weight of what was about to happen. Then he removed a sealed document. The seal was unbroken, untouched, waiting for 6 years. This, Mr. Harrison said quietly, contains Robert Bennett's final instructions regarding the remaining estate. The room froze. Remaining estate? Everyone had assumed the estate was already settled. Apparently it wasn't. Not completely. Daniel leaned forward immediately. What remaining estate? His voice sounded sharp, defensive, nervous. Mr. Harrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the document and began reading. If this document is being opened, then concerns I documented during my final years were not resolved. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, Dad sounded like himself. Careful, measured, thoughtful. I believe inheritance should reward responsibility, not entitlement. Several relatives looked toward Daniel. Nobody said a word. Therefore, I have instructed that a final review be conducted before full distribution of my remaining assets. The room grew even quieter. Mr. Harrison continued. The remaining assets include investment accounts, land holdings, company shares, and reserve funds. The numbers that followed were enormous, far larger than I expected, far larger than anyone expected. Several relatives exchanged shocked looks. One cousin actually whispered, I didn't know Uncle Robert had that much. Neither did I. Then came the sentence that changed everything. If evidence exists that any beneficiary knowingly misrepresented my wishes, concealed information, or acted against the principles outlined in this letter, their distribution shall be reviewed and adjusted accordingly. The room froze. Completely. Everyone understood exactly who Dad was talking about. Everyone. For the first time all afternoon, Daniel looked genuinely frightened. Not nervous, not uncomfortable. Frightened. Because Dad had anticipated this possibility years earlier, before he died, before the funeral, before the lies, before the rumors, before 6 years of manipulation. He had planned for it. Mr. Harrison removed another document, then slid copies across the table. The review had already been completed. The attorney looked around the room, then calmly delivered the verdict. Based on the findings, Robert's instructions require a redistribution of the remaining estate. A cousin gasped. My aunt covered her mouth. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then came the number. Daniel's share would be reduced significantly, not eliminated, not erased, reduced, substantially, because Dad believed consequences mattered, but fairness mattered too. And the portion being redirected? It was assigned to the trust. My trust. The same trust Daniel spent 6 years pretending didn't exist. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was hearing, not because of the money, because of what it represented. Proof, validation, truth. For 6 years, I had questioned myself, questioned my memories, questioned my relationship with Dad, questioned my worth. Now I finally had my answer. Dad hadn't forgotten me. Dad hadn't abandoned me. Dad hadn't chosen Daniel over me. The lie was over. And suddenly something unexpected happened. Daniel stood, slowly, silently. The room watched, waiting for another argument, another excuse, another explanation. But none came. Instead, Daniel looked around the room, at the family, at the attorney, at me. And for the first time in 6 years, he looked defeated. Not angry, defeated. Because there was nothing left to fight. The documents existed, the trust existed, the notes existed, the evidence existed, the truth existed. And truth doesn't care about confidence. Truth doesn't care about repetition. Truth doesn't care how long a lie survives. Eventually, truth arrives anyway. Daniel lowered his head, then quietly said something nobody expected. I didn't think it would go this far. The room remained silent. Because those 7 words weren't a denial. They weren't a defense. They weren't an explanation. They were an admission. A small one, but an admission. My aunt began crying. One cousin stared at the table. Another slowly shook his head. Years of assumptions were collapsing around them. Then Daniel looked at me. For the first time all afternoon. I'm sorry. The words felt strange, almost unreal. 6 years too late, but real. I studied him for several seconds. The brother I grew up with. The brother Dad loved. The brother who allowed a false story to grow until it consumed everything. Then I answered honestly. I'm not angry about the money. My voice surprised even me. Because it was true. I'm angry that Dad's memory carried a lie for 6 years. Nobody spoke. Because everyone understood. Money can be recovered. Property can be replaced. Assets can be divided. But 6 years? 6 years cannot be returned. 6 years believing your father rejected you? That's a different kind of loss. Daniel looked away, unable to respond. And for once, that was enough. I didn't need revenge. Not anymore. The truth had already done the work. The truth exposed everything. The truth restored Dad's reputation. The truth restored my peace. The truth restored the relationship I thought I'd lost forever. As the meeting ended, relatives approached one by one. Apologies, hugs, regret, support. Some admitted they should have asked more questions. Others admitted they simply believed what they were told. I didn't blame them. Not completely. Because lies become powerful when repeated long enough. But eventually, facts win. Before leaving, Mr. Harrison handed me Dad's original letter. The actual letter. The one written in his own hand. I held it carefully. Like something fragile. Something priceless. Because in many ways, it was. That evening, I sat alone on my back porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, the same way Dad used to. The letter rested in my lap, and for the first time since he died, I felt at peace, not because of inheritance, not because of justice, not because of money, because I finally knew the truth. And sometimes the greatest inheritance a parent leaves behind isn't a house, or a business, or a bank account. Sometimes it's the certainty that they loved you all along.